Hello everyone, today we talk about the relation between military aids and institutional representation during late medieval times, more specifically in Western Europe, with some greater bias for the national monarchies. This is an incredibly important topic for the obvious role that warfare has in shaping statehood, right? The Clausewitzian connection between war and politics is not just war being an instrument of politics, but also, of course, being there a double threat where the military fruits, right, and means and in fact necessities stimulate further politics that has to take care of them. This is, as you know, mostly a military history channel, so it's important to observe this from the actual cost of single campaigns. This is something that we will see better, in fact, in other videos. Today we concentrate mostly on the political, institutional side of the aisle, right? And between the 13th and the 15th century, roughly. It's just an introduction, but there are interesting examples, especially from England, Burgundy, etc. We have observed in other videos how a monarch's need for support did not remain confined to his mere recognition as the suzerain of loyal vassals. You can argue that the feudal system as such, just as a mean of prepaid military service, right, to in fact return to the Lord, had never quite fully worked, right? The same armies had never properly just been about feudal relations. There had always been other elements within them, and you can appreciate this only when you recognize, in fact, how politically fragmented at a point the system, but the politically fragmented but still complex, right, the system was. In general, also early medieval statehood is underrated, in spite of the shortcomings compared to previous or later times. The monarch relied, of course, on the active military and financial backing of his subjects in his ongoing competition with rivals within and outside his territories, where all the kinds of limitations we have observed, for example, starting from the beginning of this period, the vassal levies, like the duration of the service, in which territory. We'll keep making videos of that kind. We've made it for Louis VI, we made it for different conditions of pay and service in the 13th century. We observed how towards the 14th, properly the feudal system had been surpassed in this sense. Most of the troops were summoned through hiring, right? And as such, there was also a level of autonomy and even a voluntary element, right? It still passed through some obligations and institutional channels, but at the end of the day, if you had enough resources as a ruler, you would automatically attract an important number of fighters, and this had sort of always been the case. That's also why courts were itinerating. They moved with the treasury also on campaign, and this was the guarantee that as long as you were around as a ruler, as an active and munific ruler, you would have people willing to fight and die for you. Naturally, when the political and territorial dominions compacted, especially towards this period, like the affirmation of the national monarchies and so on, so properly regional powers that were to contend, from rivals, wrestling, probably very large amount of resources. Naturally, things got more complex and complicated, and a greater need for cohesion and political consensus was necessary, and especially for levying those resources and fundamentally money to pay the troops, and also displaying just politically the community's commitment to the cause. As the scale of military operations expanded from occasional feudal bands to professional standing armies, the military expenses really increased in parallel. Some historiography will tend to make you believe that this had to do just with the strictly economical side of the story as a precondition, as if economy could be separated gnostically from politics or war or society, right? While it is true that, let's say, the most sort of commercialized communities are the ones also, say, structuring around cities, towns, and ports were also the more military active. Well, you're just looking at the obvious. Where there were more resources, everything was more active in the first place, and it's not much the commerce per se that makes it. That's also mostly about the exchange within, but also outside. It is what kind of resources like the community produced. This is with a eminently agricultural system. And so this video is not designed to explain why, of course, like between the 13th and 15th century, like things could also go down, right? Look at the 14th century crisis, etc. But how, say, the state was in fact consolidating with more, with steadier financial revenues. We'll partly address at least the modus operandi politically, administratively now. But it's obvious that to an economic growth corresponded a growth pretty much any other field. And there were, of course, like social differentiations mirroring this. This brought to the widening, for example, composition of the consultative councils that the monarchs had always maintained at their side. This had never been born. I mean, they had always existed. And as such, they had always comforted the sovereign, had always at some point, like, of course, been a place of dispute, of controversy, of political struggle and conflict. But if you had this community, you also had like some unity, some cohesion, some commonality in purpose, right? And as such, you see, of course, these organisms developing further, especially throughout the later Middle Ages. And not just because of the absolute expansion, but of course also the relative increase in importance, as we will see now, of the elites in relation, in fact, properly to the rest of the community. The same aforementioned 14th century crisis increases the oligarchization of the system. It doesn't actually expand on, say, the individual representation of the average subject. If anything, these oligarchs are controlling ever more people that are also, in a sense, the expression of the same. This could have not been possible if these people had not somehow accepted this this condition, all right? And actually having required it also for the military sake, needing protection, and therefore authorities who could provide it to them through violence and deterrence. These same forms of political participation developed. It's not really at this point that the notion that free subjects had the right to say, to participate to practically any matter considering the reign. This went beyond the feudal demands as well, that were part of the wall as well. I mean, there was surely more direct participation of freemen into matters of political and strategical planning, and say in the early Middle Ages than there was at this point. If we, of course, individuate the single people, and then you have to understand there what we just explained regarding the establishment being, in any case, the expression still of the people, and whoever exercises a level, moral capacity, material contribution to all of this, all right? But it's in the late Middle Ages that this sense of commonality gets sanctioned better through the affirmation of the establishment's political rights. Right? It's just like, think about the Magna Carta we will be discussing now. There was a principle behind that of common law, of course, in which the English people, so all freemen, right, and here beyond any specifics of clientele dependency and social subjection, etc., would have had to, of course, be this was true actually for any other people, like to accept, to validate the sovereign's rule, because that was founded on the main and fundamental duties of protection, like of justice, of government, that had to meet the criteria of this natural God-given law that to this community that had nationally formed. When you look at 1215, and also the later and to some extent more important constitutions than the Magna Carta, you realize that, of course, here we're talking about the barons, right, that effectively ruled England as mostly feudal country without too much autonomy or liberty of, say, of the subject compared to others in Europe, and that, as such, like, you know, represented by the right, in fact, of that hierarchical power, the instances of the English people as a whole. I stress this because you may find in some texts like the notion that it's just the freemen that began to participate to what the monarchy had to do. That's not, at least in a direct sense, true at all, right? It's obvious that this can, say, politically can take many forms, it can be expressed through different theories, but this doesn't change, of course, that towards the later Middle Ages, people were ever more detached from the exercise of political vows, unlike, inexplicably, by the way, given the overwhelming consensus of any side of historiography, also political or politicized or not, has well macroscopically established at all levels of the discipline. Also, the unity of command is one of the classical principles of the art of war, and this is reflected at a statal level as well. Throughout all civilization, the most effective systems were the more politically compact and developed ones, so you could have, of course, slight differences from one another that, depending on the moral forces, could cause exceptions, but there is no doubt that say medieval armies were increasing in capacity and effectiveness because of the development of the state. Warfare emerged as a key factor in politics, leading to the elimination of many what had remained up to that point independent territorial entities, and the formation thus of ever larger states. All right, this is very crude. Like when you look at the 12th, 13th century, because we realize that it was a moment of great development, and also like one of increase in warfare. You can debate here how true that was in absolute rather than relative terms. There is no doubt things were getting more efficient and effective, and people's minds were changing accordingly. The character of warfare itself underwent a significant transformation from the compulsory feudal service by heavily armored knights on horseback to larger numbers than before, because this was definitely not a novelty, of infantry comprising militias from the communes and mercenaries wielding crossbows, pikes, firearms in the 15th century. So we're looking at, of course, like the development of the art of war in late medieval times that in many ways is not so radically different from one of the previous centuries, where we also get the impression that cavalry was kind of everything, whereas it's rather during the 13th century that it had reached the peak, but still with an important development of the same infantry that also in the previous centuries had been particularly important. And in fact, the 13th century was the only one in which cavalry in Western Europe was truly unchallenged, at least always requiring infantry as an auxiliary arm. I talked a lot about infantry warfare during the late Middle Ages, and I will keep doing so, hopefully. The point being that, of course, there are some ups and downs, some almost sinusoidal relation, like the trend in the ratio of cavalry and infantry power. The point being rather that armies become, first of all, larger by the 13th to the beginning of the 14th century, which increases definitely the cost also in relative terms, because it's a bigger system. It sort of systemically, of course, requires more energy to keep it together. Then you have the 14th century crisis, after which most of the population gets further pacified, demilitarized than what authorities had tried to do before. But in this sense, being capable of providing sort of more qualitative troops that for which basically it's a sort of refeudalization of warfare, were, however, like in part I explained this in different videos. In part, it's like the shrinking size of these armies, so the greater value of different arms in the wall. In part, it's how troops adapt to this terrain. There is an increase in fortification, in like the necessity of, again, technological development to cope with that. And so the costs increase, and also in interest of quality, right? And you have essentially a professional elite that at this point is not just mounted, but still retains, at least until the mid-15th century, that role, like the men-at-arms that it had mostly had before, but now, again, increasing cost in the panoply, as you know, in the plate armor, firearms, and more. As we saw over the centuries, the method of mobilization essentially shifted from an appeal for loyal service to negotiations about the levy or payment of soldiers. In many ways, it was a similar mechanism, and what really differed, over time, was the level of power of the same monarchy. In other words, this was emerging, especially from the 13th century, especially in the properly narrow, say Western Europe, most narrowly meant, like where the greater feudal monarchies existed, like the English one, the French, the Iberian ones, also Sicily. These were the most sort of feudal national monarchies at this point coming. The actual capacity of the king as a first among equals to impose himself among the other noblemen, or the higher nobility of the country, had increased, right? So we're not looking just at, now I'm asking you please for some help, because before, he wouldn't even get that much help. What was actually happening here is that there was a greater say dialectic, I wouldn't say conflict, because in part there was also a cooperation between the center and the, let's say, at least the top and the lower estates, in part also the center and the fringe. Like this is true also from a territorial point of view, but essentially with the public authority being able to re-exercise, like to blackmail, to threaten, right, to properly impose himself assertively and directly in arms, right, with in fact, military that was more effective than before. There are so many examples of this. I made some videos about, for example, the Magna Carta, the Battle of Bouvines, also looking at all like the various consequences in Europe in various European countries of that battle. We've seen how at that time Philip Augustus was shifting from, in fact, the vassal levy that actually gave free reins to do whatever they wanted in Occitania against the Albigensians, while he was actually operating against the Angevins. with mostly mercenary army, right? These are all things we must really look at in depth. Never really did. So I realize how much we're just beginning, like we're starting with Schwerpunkt regarding this thing. Later on, this system was not challenged anymore, and actually the aristocracy became ever more powerful in the measure in which was co-opted by, say, monarchy, right? Rather than just competing with it, with different outcomes. As you know, also England and France are a bit paradigmatic in this, because in England the royal authority gets substantially limited from previous time before the Battle of Bouvines, but also like all the baronial wars, like the 13th to the 12th century, since Henry I. Let's look at basically the peak of royal power there. That was the more advanced, to a France that actually develops all a culture, politically, institutionally, juridically, and even say in a mystical sense, of the necessity of this central power that, of course, is also connected with the vastity of France, right? England, after all, was more compact. Also, the resources were sort of more concentrated in the southeast. It was, in a sense, even easier to run in that way rather than, say, aside from, and also because it was sort of well enucleated, right? It had some fringe, like Wales, etc., but, you know, all in all, it was sort of more compact than France, right? You could have major upheavals, like the baronial wars, etc., but at this point, the further fragmentation of the system was not really on site. Also, during the 100 Years' War, France gets severely weakened in systemically and structurally, but the Valois managed to actually make it come back on its feet because of what had begun since the 13th century, especially on a national scale. So these are all things we will not digress on now, but we kind of have an idea of what we're talking about, and we will mention some kings, you know, where to locate them chronologically. For example, by the later 13th century, kings legitimized their expansive claims on service and aid by invoking really all the possible, also universal sources. For example, canonical doctrine that was based in turn on God's law, that then in part was meant to overlap with a common one, and ecclesiastical and lay institutions and law, etc., always went in parallel in this. Thinking about the conflict between Philip IV and Boniface VIII. They were allies, but they were basically at war with one another, still over, like, literally who was literally Caesar, right, as detaining Roman imperial power, with great, with the great happiness of the Holy Roman Emperors, if they were elected by that point, which they weren't actually. The kings would frame their actions, of course, as defending and preserving the kingdom in peace for the common utility of all. You can understand this was a phrase, for example, by King Philip III of France, right? We're in the second half of the late 13th century. He was a guy that actually would go on invading and even dying in Catalonia, and in fact, opening to also, under his successor, the same Philip the Fair, like new expansionistic policy towards Flanders. So these rulers were actually successful in hindsight, because you can see how, in spite of the enormous difficulties that this, say, to some degree pre-Statoil machinery, like, it had never existed at those levels in these powers, like since the Roman Empire, there had never been like an attempt to make this thing so more compact at that regional level, and the capacity, like, of achieving certain local stability. Like, this is true. If you look at the Carolingian Empire, was much bigger, like, but also much more fragile at the point. And you can understand also what were the points of the estates that were required for military contribution. That, at the end of the day, was sort of the most important I would say, amount of resources in the word meant not many other ways, but to constantly be not constantly be at war, but having the capacity of to always preserving in a at least deterrent way the integrity of this political territorial dominion. I can argue that this is the same in all eras. This is the nature of power and how it works, but of course there was a level of say much more also military justification just by the intrinsic fragility of the system that at a point needed resources and stability by conquering, by grabbing more resources, right, and or just fencing off threats, right, because that was also the point. And the 100 Years' War, especially from the French perspective, also the English one, telling the truth, because don't think that even when the English were greatly winning on the battlefields, they were faring that well at home, right? Actually, all the major battles of the 100 Years' War, if lost by the English, would have actually caused a collapse at home, right? So it was really this tells you how interdependent all these needs really were and why they also fought, right? It was not just a whim of this or that ruler, right? There were pretty sound kind of systemical reasons. Just think how convenient for the English was to just vent all the, say, nobiliar violence overseas, right? As opposed to sparing England from devastations, from feuds, and so on. But of course, the reason was also more complex than that. And again, there are, of course, if you look at financial resources, commercially, yes, the commerce was important. Banking, especially at this time, was developing as just opposed to simple money lending. But especially also at the basis of this, the steady flow of some tax income we'll talk about now was making it easier to essentially establish what would become at this point truly semi-permanent armies. This may be also an optical distortion I discussed often, say the nature of, for example, the Band of Ordonnance, the Italian states, stipendiari, similar things, and looking at the fact that de facto, like some forces were if they weren't the single individuals or the single units, but de facto they were always at this point in major powers service, like thousands of men-at-arms. I mean, we're talking the mid-14th century, right? And that would be especially the watershed when also the larger amounts of militiamen, etc., were sort of a bit removed from the battlefields because the estates that expressed them collapsed economically, demographically. That you can speak of that. But if you look at prior times, what is, I don't know, the retinue of a senior? What is a huscarl if not some de facto permanent professional and consequently professional fighter? All right. The point was, of course, evolving by scale, and so having larger armies endowed with that degree of professionalism or semi-professionalism, and consequently permanence or semi-permanence. And it's to some extent a matter of debate, right? We can spot specific turning points, some steps, right? But let's say the kernel, like the core from which eventually the so-called modern armies would develop, had sort of been grafted like already at this point on these professional figures were coagulating, were conglomerating under the guidance of the sovereign, of the higher nobility, etc. So the consequence also in political military culture is that subjects not longer had to serve in a personal sense, as long as they were willing to pay others to do so on their behalf. And this is what, especially the mid-14th century, is the true watershed of. This stems both from the fact that knights were, say, the 12th and 11th century, more individually lords of a place, where there wasn't that superstructural sort of mystique of a kingdom with a single guy ruling everybody, right? And the essentially the necessity of having also the effectiveness in this political instability and fragmentation to be more autonomous, right? To be also less lawful, less controllable, to in fact essentially either going at war or not, and in that sense being either the guy, the elite that sort of managed warfare, as say company commanders were most of noblemen, right, aside from who served in their ranks, and having in this sense also larger scale units that would be more effective on the battlefield because they were more professional, and so they had more collective training, and they were really more capable, to the benefit of the other people at home that worked essentially just to sustain the system. That's also why we talk of a refeudalization during especially the mid-14th century. All right. So the initial stage of this change was characterized by the exploitation of feudal obligations to the limit, right? When there wasn't this capacity of fiscal collection, of central control, the best you could do was, as we were saying before, once you had become, say, a more powerful guy than the other, say, as the Capetians, as this principality from the Ile-de-France that were also kings of the Western Franks, they would start sort of pressuring the nobility to serve, right? Because that was servitium debitum, right? Theoretically and legally, right? So that was owed in theory anyway. And this could also be very efficient because if you actually have this capacity of pressure, at the end of the day, you also have this capacity of coercion and monopoly, for which you are actually the guy who has the means already to force these guys into subjection, rather than these guys providing you the top-notch military service, because they are becoming poorer, right? We see it from especially the third quarter of the 12th century. Like, there are some true noblemen, let's say, and all the other knights are basically going down, and they would actually remain very important, as you know, in France, and if you look at history, that the petty nobility always had was really the backbone of the royal army in terms of at least as a whole, right? Even if they were commanded by the higher nobility. So in the 13th century, we see this extension of service to a degree, also failing, right, because of the aforementioned reason. The necessity of serving at an increasing distance from home, which had been one of the major, say, objects of contention, and also providing more, right, levies from the single fief. And these abuses are interestingly evident also in England, right? During the reign of King John, that would in part prompt, of course, not that this thing had not happened before, but that because of the collapse of Angevin, of the so-called Angevin Empire after Bouvines, the definitive one, the temporary weakness of the nobility would bring to also some permanence, in fact, of these conditions put by the barons on it, that were formalized, in fact, in the renowned Magna Carta of 1215. It was not even the single most important, it was the breaking document in this path. Then there would be, as you know, more important constitutions later on in the 13th century, even the Magna Carta, but this was really founding also the premises of the general direction, at least. And although the Magna Carta did not emerge from a representative assembly, which did not exist institutionally yet, since the barons could only speak on behalf of themselves as the king's vassals by that point, the early 13th century is still a very primitive time in many ways. Many, also economically, like the real monetization would substantially kick in the mid-13th century. Many of its provisions were subsequently referred to as a constitutional act, what's kind of obvious, British history, that enunciated, as we were saying, these fundamental principles, including the concept of no taxation without consent, right? Which actually was already a principle of legal tradition, right? The fact that these things were written down in this specific context of further also monarchic compaction is what makes them relevant in insight, because of this, again, also the further structuration was founded on the same. And so you have this beautiful passage. It sounds like, no scutage or aid shall be levied within our realm unless it is authorized by the common council of our realm. This provision applies except in cases where the ransom of our person, the knighting of our eldest son, or the first marriage of our eldest daughter are at stake. In these specific instances, a reasonable aid may be levied. Similarly, aids from the City of London shall be governed by the same principle. Right? And the Article 14 further defines the common council of the realm as comprising the archbishops, bishops, abbots, earls, and greater barons who are summoned individually by, say, our letters, it says, as well as all those who hold lands from us, so the barons in chief for a fixed term, whom we shall summon collectively through our sheriffs and bailiffs. So we see here like the embryonal establishment of what become essentially the English Parliament. The separate mention of the City of London is also very important. There is some historiographical debate regarding the interpretation as, say, just like being a sort of feudal tenant-in-chief, right, talking the city here properly, rather than the representation of a commune that existed, like as the London one. This is considered because of the old role that London had as a capital, right? London is an older capital and a proper one than Paris historically, right? Because at this point, the English kings were fundamentally just already ruling from the city of its vicinities, whereas the French, for example, had still a more itinerating court, at least also the English had, but resources, as we were saying before, were much more concentrated in the southeast of England, disproportionately so, like throughout basically the entire, until the Industrial Revolution, and to an extent still today, right? For which the city was so important, had to be considered as well, also provided substantial amount of troops, which was to be counted theoretically in the tens of thousands, which is also relevant. From 1254 onwards, consultations regarding grants on an English scale began to include knights representing the shires as well. So this was gradually bringing these various lords to the table in a more capillary territorial fashion. And this because, again, England was balanced. Eventually, it would say that there is some interesting development in statehood and difference with France, right? Because in England, even in the later Middle Ages, you wouldn't see much between the nobility and the rest of the population. In France, you have instead the bourgeoisie. You have all an administrative net that is sort of more statalized than the English one. Therefore, the English system was, if you want, simpler, even more primitive, and therefore you have these knights being initially like called, right, to a degree that, like in France, would have not really been possible for them, because they would have liked to. Everything was, they were still recognized for knighthood, for the imperial Catholic role that they had historically from a military point of view. But things were evidently changing together with the development of the hierarchy. And the representative role of these English knights down to the shire level was rooted, of course, also in the tradition of their role, in fact, as spokespeople for the counties before the itinerant royal justices, which, as you know, had already been established, in fact, but as we just observed, had a sort of more paritary level with this local seigneurial authority. It was, of course, also jealous of their own prerogatives, and however closer to the people than it was, say, in France. And now each of the 37 counties returned 2 knights in England. The first recorded appearance of representative bourgeois in a parliament for the entire kingdom dates back to 1265. However, it was not until the 20s of the 14th century that they would become permanent in representation. This is also very relevant because you understand how gradually it evolved, how it became part of a custom, just like essentially the common law was formed historically, and of course for needs that reflect the royal dependency on the estates of the realm, without which, in fact, this is the point of this video, nothing could have really been done, right, by the king alone, if not just a, say, meagerly provincial level. In 1295, in England, 114 cities and boroughs were represented, each one sending 2 members as well. You know, historically, these communities had a military duty, right? Just like every free, able-bodied man, and that dated back to probably the sort of the foundation of Englishness in a political sense. The boroughs had been established back in the day just to also counter this, also in a strategical, in fact, in plan, design, the Viking invasions, etc. London was more important than these cities. It sent 4 representatives. The number is important, but it's not meaning equality between the various members. Of course, the London representatives were more important, and they could just, by mean of the city's financial capacity, just co-opt other representatives that were connected to London's economy, etc. The English Parliament thus evolved gradually from the extension of the King's Council under the pressure of increasing financial and military needs. Right? The point of convening this Parliament was getting permission for levying money for war at large. Right? This is what statehood has sort of developed like throughout the ages in the first place. And that's why civilization is actually a multiplier of force if you look at it in historical perspective, because it's more organized, it's more disciplined, right? The Welsh and Gascon wars in the 13th century, we are talking from 1268 to 1295, I made some videos about Edward I, led to a shift in the notion of defending the realm as a national concern that all subjects shared. This is interesting because it shows how, say, also a national identity was consolidating together with the monarchic system. I say this because, of course, as we've seen, the estates are sort of represented in front of the king, and so there is a mutual recognition. And of course, war contributes to this factionalism, for which, yes, Wales is, even if it's going to be eventually annexed to the Kingdom of England proper, it's not English, and also Gascony and the French, this older enmities that had been there for from ever, right? Since the Anglo-Saxon migration to Britain, almost, at least in Britain, then France also was a long story, would contribute to sort of develop even an imperial sense of, after all, the English had always had this towards the British inhabitants, right? And the sense that the Anglo-Saxons were meant to rule over anybody who lived in the British archipelago, and that, I think about the Bret Valda, right? And it was a truly imperial notion of people's superiority and inferiority was well determined at the time. The English thought that the Scots were essentially some savage animals, right? And in some ways, I always reminded Scotland, for at least, pretty late in time, was not really a civilized country. I say it just because it's a joke I had among my colleagues regarding the truly very, like, some of the most archaic characters that remain in Scottish warfare. We talked until very late in time. We talk often about this, and you can check those out. Even though, of course, there was a hell of a English and thus sort of also Frankish Western influence on the Scots sort of developed further, also because of that pressure. So this, of course, manifested in both directions during the conflict. Think about the Scottish Wars of Independence that were actually also won, right, by the Scots. Now, in the solemn opening session of the English Parliament, the estates collectively heard the king's demands. Like, he arrived and said, look, there is this issue, things are going this way, we need this amount, let's negotiate, right? And of course, everybody knew more or less what was going on. This was, in some way, there was some debate, but politically, the situation was not novel. People knew what the monarchy needed and for which purpose already. The cathedral and parochial clergy, who ceased to attend Parliament in 1322. This is interesting because it shows how, after all, the clergy was sort of already more or less, aligned to the monarchic doings. Barons, knights, and bourgeois deliberately separately and returned different responses. This was relevant because it highlighted the individual importance, like the different thought of the various estates. And so, like, the barons, the knights, the knights are a bit of a forgotten estate in medieval and also early modern history. They were properly recognized in that function, and the strictly military one as well. The barons were sort of more politically involved. The bourgeois were the third estate, essentially, also being the greater supplies, like logistical providers, but not only. They provided militias as well. It was not until around the mid-14th century, however, that the commons formed a distinct house comprising elected representatives of the knights and bourgeois. In 1343, the knights from the shires and representatives from the communes met in the so-called Painted Chamber at Westminster Palace that unfortunately went destroyed in the 1834, if I'm not wrong, fire. This was a total disaster, artistically, historically. In any case, it had this important function. Over the course of the 14th century, the corporate identity of the commons thus grew, because, as we've seen, there had been a further stratification also within the same third estate, and so like after the 14th century crisis, there is actually an increase in international exchange and dependency, paradoxically, and the elite, right, commoners were here represented in more relevantly, and also the knights so some elements that were speaking from a more hierarchical point of view, and that thus were sort of relatively more important than their simple sum at the beginning of the first parliaments really were. They had always expressed a sort of of elite, but they in part had been sort of less important as an institution because they had not been become so narrowly hierarchical and represented thus in next to the other groups. In his writ of summons for the so-called Model Parliament in 1295, King Edward I of England acknowledged a very important concept that was, quote, "what concerns all must be approved by all," which actually is not much of a, like, okay, so if I am just one person disagreeing with this and don't feel represented and think this concerns me, I can veto everything. Actually, it was the other way around, right? Essentially, the system was structured to become more efficient and more, more decisionally effective. Had to provide with a univocal answer, either yes or no, and so this was mostly going in favor of the monarchy, because of course this function would be summoned just when the monarch knew that he could do this, and say that would have been a greater pressure, especially by the side of those more powerful elements that were more involved with the general management of the country, that therefore understood the necessity of sort of backing the monarchy after all, but also in recognition of their own self-interest, and so pressuring the others as well in accepting, right? At the same time, of course, this implied that the new custom duties required the assent of the Parliament, because the system required ever greater aids, and therefore some had to be established ex novo, and there had to be new provisions, etc. And by the way, this famous phrase, "what concerns all must be approved by all," was not really new. It had not been invented by Edward I and his advisors. It actually originated from a principle of Roman private law, which had been in these centuries reproduced by the Bolognese law school, where in the late 12th century, essentially with the school of the commentarists sort of affirms for good, like on the basis of the most important jurists, such principle, which highlights how, of course, also in more fragmented context, actually things were working civilly and subtly in the same way. Pope Honorius III applied the same principle to an invitation to Christian princes and high-ranking ecclesiastical dignitaries as early as 1222, while the Emperor Frederick II of Hohenstaufen employed it in the summons of a grand assembly of ecclesiastical and lay princes in 1244. In other words, the Bolognese school of law and the literal universal authorities had rendered it like a universal principle. Rudolf of Habsburg, king of the Romans, repeated the same concept in 1274, the moment of his rise to power, the end of the so-called interregnum. As a standard formula, the principle legitimized crucial political decisions requiring, if not the total, but still at least the broad support, like for these difficult demands, right? The important was the majority, like finding the resources, and even if, of course, somebody disagreed, like, yes, you would always have some pretty, let's say, controversial situation in which full full agreement was not possible, or at least even if they agreed, it was difficult just to enforce the collection of these contributions. But it sort of tested of course, the political dedication and the general intelligence, right, of the situation. It also implied that the ruler was bound by law and needed to recognize the interests of those concerned as well. So, yes, these contributions must be exacted, but at the same time, this comes with something else in exchange. So, some favors, some kind that will contribute to, as we've seen, elevate, co-opt essentially some individuals and compacting the establishment thus around like sort of more controllable centers. In 1297, the English barons contested King Edward I's aggressive attack on Flanders, for example, arguing that it was not a matter of defending the kingdom of England and rejecting the notion of common profit in favor of the king's argument of necessity, which implied an obligation on the commons. This is relevant because you understand even today how isolationism actually is a counter force to civilizational development. Power, right, war domination, the general expansion of your rule is the ultimate principle of any system, and this is what the same Kingdom of England had been established like. So in this case, of course, we see an opposition to a royal policy that was also the one that would eventually continue, like dragging the country into the 100 Years' War, but also to some greater purpose because of the story, like the English fool, the Flemish manufactures, the French attempts to invade, to say re-establish at least the royal rule in Flanders, and the English intervention and more. I talked about Flanders, by the way, around these years, all the issues between the King of France, the local, the Count, and also this external, in fact, English intervention. Although the king's interpretation ultimately and sort of obviously prevailed, at least in a condition of civilizational success, it limited his same rights to demand his subjects' aid for defense. At least this is the case of England because of the sort of the traps like the baronial establishment had placed to the sovereign to some extent. For example, during the 9-year truce with Scotland, we are between 1297 and 1306, no taxation was levied. This was a critical aspect of the war. I mean, there were some, as we've seen, we'll see now, taxes that were always levied and so provided with this sort of steady flow of cash. The the major contributions that were required for extraordinary, say, expenses with war that costs enormously, and so understandably creates perplexities to an extent, was a different matter, right? And so you understand how delicate the situation really is. Establishing a continuity in contribution is, generally speaking, what the estates do not want, because they can't pay for a specific reason. So far, this is positive for them, that they can profit partly from it. Otherwise, it's difficult for the monarchy to simply ask for them, right? For example, also in more turbulent times where here we are during the 100 Years' War, at least the truces that occurred within it, that were, say, the war with France was still somewhat on the horizon, and so a big clash. No taxes were levied in that form during the years of truce with France between 1360 and 1369. Also, there was no direct taxation in England in 1422 to 29. for the reason at this point that we're looking, as you know, at the period of English occupation of large swaths of northern France, so that these territories were expected to cover war expenses that, as we've seen, would make both the monarchy and the barons happy. And so that's why in part also the 100 Years' War was fought, right? At least at that point there was much to profit from that situation. During periods of intense warfare, instead, such as 1294, 1298, this is the Gascon War, we're still talking about England, right? The early years of the 100 Years' War, so 1338, 1342, for example, taxation reached unprecedented peaks for obvious reasons, and really costs a freaking lot. You understand also why a defeat in battle at this point would have been just nullifying all the contributions. Look at the contemporary situation. You understand that well, right? You want to see results on the battlefield when you invest so much money. Aside from what the strategy and the political direction, there is some sort of greater impression from the community that derives also simply and banally from that, and doesn't reason, in fact, too much on the long term. For this reason, in those years, the English Parliament associated petitioning for redress with supplying money, thereby significantly expanding its authority across all areas of governance. In other words, they would contribute the given amount, but they wanted, as we were saying, something in exchange as well. They wanted to be co-opted, they wanted to have greater control on resources from the within. Indirect taxation, particularly on exported wool, which, as you know, in English economy was a very important thing at this point, was introduced first in 1275. Also in 1354, the Commons granted it for an unprecedented 6-year period. The wool subsidy became a permanent crown revenue, right? It's something that will last until the ship money, the English Civil War. And this was under parliamentary control. And that's why at the time, of course, the parliament was just entrenching behind, no, it's just the thing on the wall. We don't want to pay for an more efficient army at the time. And it's very much interconnected with this, because technically, like, until the new model army, like, if you go back in time, like, England was not so updated, militarily speaking. They hadn't, after the 100 Years' War, really done much to further recommit, if not with some investment in the navy especially, right? But the army was pretty, at least until the mid-16th century, was still competitive then. Things started really gapping excessively for the continental development. And that's why what Charles I was trying to do. I have something in character projectually on the English Civil War, by the way. We have to resume a bit of that. Made some videos already. So it's a very interesting chapter, Western history. But going back to our Middle Ages, the English wool subsidy became a permanent crown revenue under parliamentary control, with Parliament granting it for short periods and negotiating duration, amount, appropriation, treasury appointments. Understand how complicated it was, and so how also it deformed, like how heterogeneous, right, it was. This came with the relative burdens on native and foreign merchants alike. It really depended on so many aspects. Now I'm skipping here all the English relations, by the way, with international finance, especially the Italians. We have seen this in many videos, but much of that extra wealth also came from these debts that the crown contracted autonomously, which is also a fascinating aspect. Now, in the territories under the crown of Aragon, so changing theater here, the clergy, nobility, and towns were habitually summoned from around the 80s of the 13th century. We discussed widely the nature of the Aragonese crown. This was not a kingdom, right? At least Aragon was a kingdom individually, but we speak of the crown of Aragon to signify the dynastic sum that, in fact, the Aragonese house made of various territories across the Mediterranean, and that here, of course, developed in a sort of confederal way, which every chunk was very jealous and autonomous in their own prerogatives, and therefore made it sort of more contractual, negotiable to levy the military contributions. It was easier in places like Navarre, Castile, or Portugal, because everything was more feudal, monarchic. There was a heavy, like it was already the oligarchies were much more sort of, they could be really a pain behind and risk to destabilize everything, as we've seen in numerous videos, the one about Ferdinand IV of Castile, for example. Spain was very messy in many ways, but they, the feudal system, at least as unitary as it was as a single kingdom, was sort of more singularly oriented. Like Castile was a bit more like France. It was bigger. It required more of an iron fist to be ruled, and it would end up hegemonizing the Iberian Peninsula. Now, in Aragon, instead, the knights, also known as the ricos hombres, so the rich men, were separately summoned and institutionalized. As we've seen, this was normal. It happened also in Germany, etc. So in this case, they became a sort of fourth estate, not that fourth estate as we came to, like it's just numerically like an extra one, in 1389. By the way, it's relevant because these are the years in the second half of the 14th century in which all the peasant revolts try actually to make the peasants enter as a fourth estate in the parliaments. And they had the chance of doing so successfully, and they all failed clamorously, right? And that's how they went under, as we were saying before. Made lots of videos on this too. Now, in Aragon, the 1283 statute stipulated that annual summonses would be issued, so tending to stabilize the flow temporarily, because the same source contemplated a gradual reduction in frequency in subsequent years. So say not eliminating them, but at least if there is a crisis, must raise this, and at least we can try to establish a minimum over time. This is very important because the idea even of projecting these summonses over time was not to be given for granted at all, right? It was mostly stemming from the goodwill of the estates of in this case actually also of all the various territories that had sort of different estates on their own. Again, the Crown of Aragon it's pretty complex, right? Now, the duties of these institutions included the custody of privileges, preservation of justice and peace, the approval of statutes, and voting on taxes for legitimate purposes, which meant, of course, that everything was subject to debate. The extensive warfare with Castile in these years rendered the Aragonese monarchs heavily dependent on their cortes. The cortes are the local parliament. In 1359, Peter IV of Aragon was forced to relinquish judicial supremacy to the Cortes of Catalonia in exchange for a subsidy. In other words, the Catalonians were saying that were also like essentially the center of the Aragonese crown finances, right, with Barcelona, etc. They were saying, okay, we must essentially maintain all the judicial control, so having an unprecedented level of governmental capacity in order for us to give you the money that you require. And this was a very shrewd maneuver because evidently Catalonia was willing to pay for the war because they were interested in it anyway, but in exchange to the king. They could wait to the degree of obliging the king of Aragon to relinquish such judicial supremacy. And really, the control over justice was also one of the single most important source of wealth, strictly speaking. So of course, the Catalonian would give like more money. Now, naturally, the war was much more costly, but this sense of the fact that they sort of retained something that, in origin, according to legal tradition, was theirs to begin with, in the first place, is the crucial aspect here, with an enormous, of course, autonomy that the Catalonia had within the system. And this led also to the establishment, in fact, of a permanent administrative committee. So you see, what they gained now a fixed institutional organism that would be later known in history as the Deputación del General. So the general deputy from the Major. And the lack of support from the Cortes of Aragon compelled the king also to abandon his war with Castile in 1429. In other words, they had exhausted themselves, they didn't want to pay anymore, and that's how it went. And all these chunks, again, Catalonia, Aragon, the Balearic Islands, Sicily, here we're not with Naples already, but Sardinia, etc., would be able to shift, you see, this literal amount of wealth, and considering that these chunks were also ruled by different vice kings, there was no unified rule really, because every, in fact, kingdom was a sort of a different thing. It was just the crown that dynastically had summed them, but in theory they could do whatever they wanted, including at some point even being really one against the other politically, and quasi war situation. Right. We'll talk more about the crown of Aragon. So, as a consequence, there was a persistent dynastic drive for expansion as well, because this could allow this would respond in part to the demands of the same estates to, say, seize control of a certain area, certain assets, certain territory. And this was, for example, evident in Aragonese policy with the same government of Sardinia and Sicily. Sardinia was, for example, in the north infested by the Genoese, and there was a lengthy guerrilla going on, and it cost a lot. It drained lots of resources. Sicily also was not faring overwhelmingly well, but stabilizing those maritime connections, especially because that's also what the Catalonian establishment from Barcelona was interested in, securing the ports, right, so that they could make money. Then the interland was relatively optional. Like Sicily was run by the local barons to be strictly concrete, and Sardinia too was pretty messy, as we've seen. And the situation sort of brought the kings to negotiate with their influential subjects unavoidably. This would be particularly true for Naples. I have a video incoming exactly about the Aragonese sort of mindset to cope with the Neapolitan barons, just like since Angevin times, if not beforehand, literally just sort of taking over the hinterland. There was no other way of proceeding, and so if you wanted to rule there, you had to simply negotiate with them. There's a sort of pre-mafia sort of mentality, but it was really just universal in the lack of a truly modern state that sort of hegemonizes control completely, also be able to exercise it uniformly on the territory. This was completely unknown at this time. What you have in the absence of the state is mafia. There is nothing else, right? And the state sort of evolved in that way too, and so then it learned to do things more effectively, more efficiently, and still to, at that point, to a broader good, after all. From 1295 onwards, King Philip of France, under which the country was at the peak of its medieval power, felt compelled to amplify his demands in the regional assemblies of Languedoc, that, as you know, had been essentially subsumed by the French crown in the same second half of the 13th century, after the effective destruction of the country during the Albigensian Crusade. This employed the legal justification of the so-called right of state. The French were really going hard on this subjective areas that basically had collapsed, and also historically had never had like a solid dynastic power, like a princely authority, like controlling a provincial or even regional dimension. Right, the North was much more robust in that sense. That's the reason also in part why the South was conquered by the North. In 1302, which is also the year of the war against the Flemish and the terrible defeat at the Battle of the Golden Spurs, Philip extended the tradition of regional assemblies to the scale of the entire realm. The primary issue was not, however, war, but his aforementioned conflict with Pope Boniface VIII, that he also came to rob, as you know, through Philippe de Nogaret and Sciarra Colonna. This goes in parallel with the trial to the Templars, like the confiscation of Jewish property. Times also the Italian one, even though those that presence had would be restored. This was also common, like among various powers at some point, to confiscate mostly their rivals' wealth. This was not really the case, because actually the Saint Philip relied heavily on some Italian, say, war businessmen, contractors, including that year after the defeat. He would hire Lombards, Tuscans, Spanish for fighting against the Flemish communes. So it's a very precarious situation, also sort of a destabilized one. I made a video about the French monarchy from Philip IV to Charles the Sixth, or Charles V actually, and there is a lot going on in after the expansion of this Leviathanic system that now needs money to be sustained further, and part of the 100 Years' War dynamics sort of were triggered by this collapse of the bigger systems, like the universal ones that France had fundamentally become, almost replacing the Holy Roman Empire as the leading power in Europe. But at the same time, this structuring, right, would also help, like, to maintain the building stain. Again, the dissolution of the Templar Order in 1308 was definitely the catalyst for consultation with 3 estates of Philip's realm, later referred to as the General Estates. It was a matter of political testing. If you could summon this parliament regularly, and with all the estates represented, this wouldn't happen too often, right? It was not always the king's intention, but when it was in fact to give more validity to his doings, right? The significant influence of the church was also a key factor for driving the French king's urgent search for backing. As we've seen, the success of these initial gatherings led to a third assembly in 1314, at which a purely financial aid was demanded to offset the substantial costs incurred by the king's ongoing war against the Flemish. During the first half of the 14th century, various assemblies were held in France, some being regional, others comprising specific orders. It wasn't yet as uniform and homogeneous as we would come to know this institution historically. We have seen it also for the English Parliament. The devastating losses suffered during the first phase of the 100 Years' War also prompted French intense activity among the general estates of the Pays d'Oil, that was northern France, as we've seen, the most active, the one that had to control everything, even though part of the fringe, especially in the south, was sort of lost de facto to the English chevauchés. We're talking the years 1355 to 1359. These were particularly tough because of the defeat of Poitiers that I made a video on for the battle series, when the King of France, John II, was captured. The French had to pay an enormous ransom. The king would die in exile anyway, and there is the Jacquerie. As a consequence, we talk also a bit about this peasant perspective regarding the aforementioned, like now further subjection to an elite that was there in virtue of its function of defense, and when the latter came less because of this disaster, of course the peasantry took up arms, but they were also bloodily repressed, and they lost their place in the parliament, in the general estates. Similarly, in England, the extraordinary demand for the same war, without which the English victories would have been possible, made by the monarchy, sparked counterclaims from representatives. In 1355, the first problem was monetary in nature. They wanted essentially to stabilize the criterion through which this enormous exactions would be requested. Thus, the point around which the parliamentary debate revolved was the consent of the king's subjects to the same taxation. In 1356, the control of the general estates in France over the selection of royal councillors gained preeminence. This experience proved detrimental to the monarch, because following sessions in 1369, in which the decision to launch a new campaign against the English was approved, this was another field army, right, with all the costs stemming from also a chewed, let's say, an eaten country now with more reduced resources, and so greater burden for individual provinces. The French kings opted for separate negotiations with the provincial estates, exactly for this reason. In part, it was a way not to make everything sort of depend on a single session, so if they would all say no, basically at least there would be a broader decision that the other estates would have felt sort of entitled to write. Instead, if you ask province by province, estate by estate, you could have, I've seen that something similar to Aragon, you could have had some more success. At least you would be more careful about it. Typically, here there was the issue again of the Languedoc and Languedoc, because the north had at least more control on the situation. The south was instead a bit left to itself. The significant distances between regions and the disparate fates of the north and the south during the 100 Years' War undoubtedly contributed also to their divergent institutional evolution. Essentially, the north it was required, say, had this greater effort, but it also, we've seen this in the videos about Louis the 11th, about Charles the 7th, how, like, to a sort of subjection to the market, to at least an exhaustion in part of some estates, the necessity of backing the monarchy also from a third estate perspective against the nobility, and sort of a more concerted effort that could provide, even with the chances of reconquest and so of further centrality and preeminence of the north in the recompaction of the Kingdom of France. In the south, conversely, things were sort of dramatic, because anyway the war was ravaging the countryside. The locals, as we've seen, had been already broken. There wasn't like another chunk of the country politically autonomous from this, if not the Guyenne was backing the English. As a consequence, the means of military contribution collection would be less mature over time, but still making essentially the South weaker when the North came back, again regaining what they had lost. Almost every year during the period of very intense war from 1421 to 1439, this is like after Azincourt, when the English and the Burgundians enter Paris. Basically, the French monarchy was reduced just to Orléans, as you know, and there is the coming back. The aforementioned Charles VII convened assemblies of the general estates, or those of western or eastern Languedoc separately, to request aids. However, after introducing the taille in 1439-40, that was sort of a regular contribution, he no longer required these troublesome partners. Within the art of the realm, representative assemblies were held only during moments of crisis. They subsequently disappeared completely. In peripheral principalities such as Normandy, Artois, Dauphiné, Burgundy, I made a video for the history of all these single elements, and particularly Languedoc and Provence, where a solid tradition existed prior to the incorporation into the monarchy. The estates continued to meet at most once a year and defended their particular interests and privileges. In other words, as we were exemplifying, in the north, the success of the monarchy in contribution collection was just through normal fiscal flows so efficient that the entire system was subsumed under the French monarchy. The South was more decentralized for a while. They also maintained some autonomy out of that, so that their estates were somehow respected. It would actually become later the mean of dialogue with the crown, not because these places were particularly powerful, but exactly because you could even do without them. They were not so crucial, after all, for the general income of the crown. When during the minority crisis of 1484 the Estates Generals were summoned again, more than 2/3 of delegates for the Third Estate and 1/5 of nobles were royal officials already. So you can imagine how, so you understand what we were saying before, that the French monarchy had succeeded in creating a true state. Here we are at the very end of the Middle Ages. France had the most advanced state at that point in Europe, but that had already been the case since, at least as a whole, as a general Leviathan, as I like to call it, from the 13th century in scale. And at this point you find properly royal officials that, as we've seen also in other videos, were but substituting themselves to the more powerful nobiliar elements, at least counterbalancing them. And of course not really caring of this, because they were also elite at the end of the day, about the political participation of the subjects. I mean, their even their freedom of speech. I mean, at the time, the thing was not so much relevant or like significant as we think of it today. And these people were there just to profit from their position for, of course, the functional purpose of sustaining the crown that was growing as a great power, was essentially to regain so many territories lost. So there was, of course, a positive function of this all in perspective. And that's why we were saying before, yes, that you can equate this to the mafia in a way, but it's not like eventually this doesn't provide you the means to actual further development. That's why France would reach this level, right, of power and general development, whereas other countries in Europe, they were hopelessly fragmented, especially in Central and Eastern Europe. Like they would be so, but like being ruled by the mob for a much longer time. And when you look at, for example, Rudolf of Habsburg, that fought a lot to actually recompact the Kingdom of Germany after the demise of the Swabians, the Interregnum, etc. As King of the Romans, consolidated his position, first of all, by securing taxation agreements in city assemblies in 1284 and 1290. And this was actually going in parallel with the subcontracting so many public rights, just like the late Swabians had done themselves. But the effort was to save what could be saved of the previous public structure. What Rudolf was summoning here was a type of assembly or general aid that wouldn't, however, become traditional practice in the empire prior to the 16th century. I made a video about specifically the Habsburgic government that period that illustrates how dramatically complicated that the whole thing still was at the time. So imagine in Rudolf's time, where of course things had to be literally fought through like with a sword, more than, saying relative terms, more than it would be the case later, even if those were still very violent times. And this was obviously due to the relative weakness of central power in Germany, the significant strength of territorial princes and barons that had been taking over public prerogatives during the power vacuum and had turned like this, say, Germany into that princely, say, forest that we have described also in a mini-series last winter, explaining exactly how Germany was working in the later Middle Ages. That is very interesting. And in any case, you know that I have lots of playlists where you can find all this. So if you look at medieval Germany, you will find all what I'm talking about. As we've seen in the latter series, there were some parts of the empire that were pretty much on their own, right? Within the same Kingdom of Germany, some areas wouldn't even witness properly the presence of imperial authority. And especially since the country had been, it still was like one like as a realm, but now that the institutions having collapsed, the princes, also at the peripheries, were to deal with things like at the provincial level from scratch, right? Because there wasn't something like just simply like an estate. At least the history of Germany had been there had been some, as you know, ethnic duchies that for a while went on with probably some recognized local custom, etc. But the feudal law had, in many ways, like broken. Even the same original districts had sort of intertwined everything. So there were 300 states, right? So there are some issues here in the institutionalization of clearly defined estates to negotiate with. For example, Duke John I of Brabant, made a video about medieval Brabant, is believed to have negotiated with the corporate nobility, cities, and abbeys individually, right, between 1290 and 1303. At this point, we are at a very intense level of fragmentation, also because the Habsburgs are temporary, like aside from the power explosion, we're going down. There were some dynasties here also from this western part, think about the Luxembourgs shifting towards the east, just like the Habsburgs had done in the first place. And during this period, Duke John I of Brabant granted privileges to the nobility as a whole, for example, as well as to 8 major towns and several abbeys. This was done to essentially co-opt them, and receiving in exchange from his authority. Brabant was essentially the most powerful polity in the province of what had been Lower Lorraine, considered with the receipt of substantial financial aid from the same recipients of those privileges. So obviously this was negotiated, but it was the embryo of a first establishment that would be recognized the estates eventually of like the Netherlands. Later on we'll see now how, of course, this passed especially through the Burgundians. I made a video specifically about the Burgundian government and administration in the 15th century, so that's relevant. A notable concession still at the beginning of the 14th century made was the right of resistance in the event that the privilege of this communities were violated. Right, this was granted both to the nobility, individual towns. It would be interesting to descend here a bit more in the details, but you can check out that video about medieval Brabant to understand a bit the political temper, the relation with the neighbors here. And now, during the minority of Duke John III of Brabant, we are between 1312 and 1320, a regency council led by the towns held power. In this area, towns had began to become the political point of reference, right? Also because of their important commercial development, and this is how the duke's finances came fully under the control of these estates, like namely the towns, but also the knights, right? And also here you see are ranked. This was the case in the empire. The knights, especially because of properly the Holy Roman Imperial ideology, were to be seen as the guys here who held the empire par excellence, right? The accumulated debts of Duke John III's predecessors necessitated, by the way of strong intervention by his subjects. The nobility was chronically indebted for pursuing all these power policies. A comparable example can be seen in Bavaria in the year of the Golden Bull, 1356, where a committee comprising members from the local estates levied taxes, participated in the election of councillors, and heard grievances. Bavaria was essentially also split in 4 different branches of the houses of the House of Wittelsbach that also had various possessions scattered across Germany. I made a video about medieval Bavaria as well. Here you understand how the local estates gain relevance, right? They are also becoming more elite gradually because the crisis had struck everywhere, and therefore this let's say privileges going parallel with the elevation of the single, say, say, magnates that were the representatives of these estates. We see a very interesting case in the Lüneburger Satte of 1392. We are in the north of Germany, it's Saxony, and I talked about Lüneburg also in a recent video about the German dynasties at this point. This was a real mess of a place, by the way, in terms of that fragmentation. And as a consequence, this diet witnessed, it was a council essentially, a session, 8 burghers temporarily gaining control of the ducal finances, right, the Duchy of Lüneburg, hearing grievances and even receiving recognition for their right to confiscate domanial income, as well as resisting the Duke in arms, should there be a reason. You see how ambiguous this is. It's just like what we're saying, that some legitimate moves, or whatever this constitution stated as, some sort of common reason. It could be common sense. It could be interpretable, of course. What is really of public, of collective concern? What should we consider legitimate or not? But this aspect of Lüneburg is very interesting, because confiscating domanial income meant literally appropriating oneself of the public land, right? So these burghers temporarily were to do so, like at least they could do it in case of violation from the side of the Duke. And remember that princes in Germany were not omnipotent, but were by far like the strongest element, right? Communes didn't have much power outside of the city walls, right? And even resisting in arms against ducal authority, right? So probably the Duke was seen as infringing upon certain specific privileges that had been obtained in this sense because these burghers had backed the dukes financially. So that's how they had obtained them. In the first place, they could simply take these ducal prerogatives, essentially occupying the public land, because the Duke is recognized also by the Emperor as the guy who has the power of exercising, as we've seen, violence, of justice, etc. So must control the public domain, right? At this point, these guys were having back the Duke can, under, like this was written down, like as a deal, in some cases, of course, emergential and quite disputable as well, really occupy ducal territory and even resisting to the Duke in arms. The institution of taxation, as you understand, played a crucial role in the development of representative institutions, although it was not the sole determining factor. It's well established that, aided by the dire state of the realm, the kings of France, for example, were able to introduce permanent indirect taxes that were exempt from the consent of the estates. We pointed at that before. If you wanted large exceptional contributions, you had to summon the estates, because there was no other way to get them, practically, right? However, there were all indirect taxes that you could place on goods, right? For example, in 355, the general estates accepted in France the gabelle. It was a salt tax. Salt cost a lot. It was one of, as you know, the best mean of preserving food normally. Then 1/30 of the value of merchandise as well, which was eventually increased to 1/20 in 1435. It's not a few. A 5% tax by pre-industrial times, and the general ones that had existed in the Middle Ages previous to that is substantial. And on the general good that you really have, right? So you must be dynamic about this. We've seen how even the aforementioned the video about Charles VII, in order to become a crown's official, you needed a lot of money on your own, and very often you would lose it, right? If you didn't invest it in some risky business, you couldn't make enough money to sustain your status. If you invested it in land, you were cut out of the system, because the king needed that money in cash, right? From 1440 onwards, the annual taille was levied by the king's officials directly. This was also how they hoped to gain from it, and yes, it was about seizing part of this, but also needing to again provide the king with that wealth, and providing with extra personal contributions, as we've seen. And these taxes enabled the French king to become relatively independent of the estates. Again, this indirect taxes had always existed to some extent, but now they provided with a substantially large amount of wealth to maintain, for example, semi-permanent companies of ordnance. We've seen it as the nucleus of essentially the permanent French army. That was a relevant force, by the way. It was essentially billeted across northern France, and it could be summoned, and there were ways to, of course, make it an effective anti-nobiliar power that in fact that estate was fearing, right? And also being probably the bulk of as we've seen, of a professional army, at least the professional bulk of an army. And in Burgundy we have interesting developments. As you know, the Burgundian state, so what had been created by the Dukes of Burgundy, a bit by inheritance, a bit by military expansion, and profiting of the 100 Years' War, the royal weakness in France, and the fragmentation of the western frontier of the empire, was one of the most important powers in Europe during the 15th century. Also very advanced, very rich, yet a bit less homogeneous administratively, and in fact also the solidity of the state should not really be overstated in this historical perspective, not just for how it ended, but in some ways if you look at how it really worked. It was a great difference and distance, by the way, also not quite a comfortable continuity between Burgundy proper, that was actually a very solid princely state, a very advanced one in the first place, but also all these other feudal states in between that, in Flanders, and instead was more like a communal reality, however deprived of some true central capacity. Mostly was in fact financing the Burgundians, and in the Burgundian state the estates controlled the collection of the fouage, it's like the fire, it means that the fireage or earth tax, and so the tax on houses, and family nuclei, and reserved a budget for their own expenses. Nevertheless, all indirect taxes introduced earlier by the French crown were able to evade the interference of the estates. In Brittany, for example, the estates were likely convened for the first time in 1352 to agree on extraordinary taxation. Right? This is particular for paying the ransom of the Duke Charles of Blois, one of 3 feudal cases, by the way, if you remember in the article that we read from the same Magna Carta, that the English barons were saying, we must be supported in practice if we need a ransom, and to each other, basically that was also the purpose. Brittany had something similar in this regard. In 1365, the financial burdens of war also compelled the introduction of the fouage throughout the entire duchy, with estates granting permission for its implementation. Not even one document speaks regarding the port dues levied by the Duke of Burgundy. This shows, as we were saying before, that there wasn't much political activism, especially Flanders, that was the richer place outside Burgundy, was actually getting some sort of national compaction through Burgundian administration and this estates summoning rather than the other way around. In other words, these estates obeyed to the House of Burgundy. They also did it for general international reasons. For example, they would ultimately lead to the acknowledgement of the Duke's two daughters as rightful heiresses in 1486. That's also how the remnants of the Burgundian inheritance left. They had, say, unoccupied by the French, that took the entire Burgundy, for that matter, the duchy and more, passed to the Habsburgs. All right. So that was a critical situation and circumstance that would actually bring to the acceptation of this. They could have bailed out, but then we would have defended them. At least the Habsburgs succeeded in that. However, assemblies of estates did not always acquire overarching powers due to their control of taxation in general. In certain instances, that taxes were under the jurisdiction of representative institutions limited to a single estate, often comprised of a city and rural area representatives. So the idea of the estates was, yes, they were estates, but it's not that they would necessarily behave cohesively. That's why the parliament was a place where a lot of negotiation could go on, because you had different estates, different power within them. We've seen, for example, the weight of London in England. And as we were pointing out before, the south of France, for example, in the relative kingdom had remained less developed. For example, in the late 13th century, Languedoc witnessed the increased burden of military levies and aids, also mostly because of the royal wars that were occurring, as we've seen also from the English side, against Foix and Gascony. But in spite of course, the contributions that the kings of France could ask for this war, there was no establishment of general assemblies of three estates. Right? Instead, matters were addressed in local gatherings, separate assemblies and individual orders that would also sort of take matters in their own hands, would depend on sort of more fragmented situations, something that, again, doesn't speak for a greater organization, but in fact this area was more disorganized. It was more difficult also to exact contributions from there. The point being that, of course, if there was a war, like in this case, neighboring a certain land, contributions would more likely to come from there. Also because if you had to send, normally at this point, as we've seen, there were mostly money required, just paying mercenaries, and those would have been found. They would have been around, but also just like for moving the army, having a base in friendly territory, you would have to, of course, squeeze these regions in some way. That the armies would have crossed this place. Remember, there were no barracks at this time. You had to billet the troops. Of course, at this point, the armies were mostly disbanded after the campaign. But the general burden of the same was deeply felt, in this. As we've seen, fragile systems like agriculture was pretty, pretty delicate, pretty scarce crop rate and crop yield, and even an army passing one season was a distressful event, even when it was friendly. And by the way, it's not that if the troops were friendly, they wouldn't pillage or similar things. These problems would go on till the French Dragonade of the 17th century against the Calvinists, quite appropriately, during the wars of religion. Now, at least, say, in the general conflict, also after the wars. Before, we observed a similar relation between the Duke of Brabant and the local estates. In Flanders, it was not until the 15th century that the Count Philip the Bold, Duke of Burgundy, as Count of Flanders, instituted the assembly of 3 estates, as they would be maintained, as a parliament, practically. So as we've seen, that it was mostly the Burgundians who would develop further, like they needed to homogenize assemblies, representation, because it was better just to cope these people that have them all fragmented, not knowing how to do together. This is exactly how, I don't know, some powers are able to subsidize even political opponents just to control them better. It's not just tribute, it's also properly compacting them. We've seen it often. Say, it has nothing to do with it, but say to some extent, like in perspective it does, like during the migration era. The coalescence of barbarian confederacies, in many ways that had been fostered by the same Roman Empire that didn't want to cope with all different scattered tribes that were uncontrollable. They wanted a single strong man to manage the war. And although aids had been granted by assemblies of cities, sometimes including rural districts, the matter in Flanders would remain pretty much the same, The second half of the 13th century had witnessed the integration of the communes of Flanders in these assemblies because of the centrality of Ghent, Brugge, Ypres, These were some of the most important trade centers in Europe, and especially on the North Sea, and it was kind of obvious to involve them in any level of financial aid for the Count of Flanders. That could be very different people depending on the eras. And again, I made specifically that video I remember before about the Count of Flanders, the communes, and the King of France. Very different things overall. So as we have seen, as a final sum of this long video, we can infer that taxes played a pivotal role in fostering this fuller participation by representative institutions. But only when taxation became excessive or was mismanaged by government. This was the main concern. This is more evident in the stronger national monarchies, England, France. Today we didn't talk about so many other places like Castile was somehow similar, or how this worked, for example, in the Italian states. We'll go step by step. And the obvious mover of this was prolonged warfare, or even just warfare, because that was always intense anyway, right? So at that point, as we've seen for the kings, the alternative means of surplus extraction were insufficient, right? They had indirect taxation and general revenues from the public demand, but that was not enough, right? It was asphyctic in comparison. There was a lot of money around. There were, considered this, it's not just an internal mechanism. Before we mentioned the Lombard bankers, right? But it's obvious that if you are say England and France are fighting against one another, there is an enormous international involvement in this, and so there are people who are going to invest in one or the other, and so the crowns are going to receive a certain amount of help from different actors, and so means will be found in a way, and that's why the estates are so active and so involved, because it's not just about, as we put it today, about the king and the estate. It's about the general outcome. What is that these people wanted politically? Right, look at Paris that lets the Burgundians and the English enter, hoping to be some sort of metropolis in a decentralized frontier where the merchants could do whatever the hell they wanted. Eventually, it didn't end well. It didn't seem like a good recipe, and Paris is a testament to this still today. To this day, I made a video about medieval Paris, by the way. Have to come back a bit on medieval cities, and so even if ultimately sovereigns would gain the upper hand, at least in England things were more mitigated. In France especially things would work, but in general in Western Europe, Southwestern Europe, things would be more functional, or at least let's say more in favor of the monarch through bitter fightings. But you do have, in this sense, the estates able to gain control in part, at least over part, in fact, of the states, and sometimes even the ruler's finances. We've seen it before, from the bigger to the smaller instances, when there is a regency, when there are some rights that seem to be infringed upon, some emergential conditions. We've seen the Catalonians basically regaining control of their own judicial rights. The Lüneburger burghers like getting probably the right to resist the Duke by the Duke, right? That's the interesting thing. And even usurping what was public imperial demand that the Duke was entrusted with. And so all this, meaningful enough, was to secure, of course, rights for themselves, and actually, we said it in perspective, to be subsumed to this, being co-opted by the system as well, right? So we're not looking at, I don't know, towns or villages being represented in the estates for saying, oh my God, these peasant communities are so important, or we need them. Nobody cared about them. Actually, notoriously in France, the cities began to swell, especially in the front, in the external areas. Some centrality as far as the royal officials' operations, the local patriciate fundamentally, and these are people primarily dealing with, say, we're talking about privileged citizens, right, or at least elites, using the representative institutions to expand and safeguard their collective privileges. So not really extending it to down the line, right? They were the same people who gave to work and to eat to the others, right? So that's why it happens. But we're looking in this sense at the full ancien regime, the crystallization of an oligarchy towards the end of the Middle Ages would essentially rule until the contemporary era. And it begins here, right? It's not bringing people closer, the subjects, the individual average guy, the Jacques Bonhomme, closer to power at all, right? The opposite is true. But at the same time, it's functional, right? Eventually, like, the third estate will grow during the ancien regime, so much so that they will also put it down at a point. Why? Because they had grown powerful, and because they had come to control themselves a large part of the system. And so when the elite sclerotized, it became to depend too much on them. That's where the thing flipped. And it was not even just something that must happen forcibly, like. But all these powers were always on the edge, right? This is an underappreciated aspect that I tended to highlight, especially when we talk about single rulers, and the fact that they were say, civilizationally, they were successful. You understand, these states are developing, they're, say, modernizing, if we can so say. But if you look at the individual rulers and their struggle, it seems like these guys were to be overthrown from a moment to another, at every time. And this is where you can appreciate how successful this rule was. It doesn't matter how gradual the development of subtle power was, but still it happened, because unitly, like in this iron arm wrestling between the various estates, still, right, the direction was, let's stabilize the system, which is never to be given for granted, but people do, after all. And so there is always a role in that direction that we shouldn't bail out of, because you see, what people really do, it's not that they really tear down the system, it's that they let others do, they let it collapse by itself, right? So it's being driven away, but not participating, not struggling. And people actually at the time struggled much more than today. But in many ways, it's always up to us. Right? These videos are, I think, always pointing towards the same direction. You can't read it in the opposite sense. Right? If this system had been a failure, how is it possible that they would increase in power? And say people would just also have actually a better life, in spite of the relative loss of liberty within the institution. This is also not to be given for granted, because at the end of the day, like, mostly all powers do this. Mostly that some will fail when the system is unsustainable. There are, in fact, instances of this kind. But generally speaking, people make things work. Just it does take a lot of work, it takes the struggle, it takes competence. And these are things that you definitely must earn your badges for, like so Schwerpunkt for. In any case, for today I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.